Hello everyone, welcome to the second issue of our Bulletin of Near Eastern Excavations and Research. I am Valentina Santini and I'm going to moderate the various lectures of this series. Since unfortunately the COVID-19 pandemic is still in progress, we decided to arrange a new series of online lectures in this new bulletin, which, as the first issue was lectures, can be found here on YouTube on the channel of CAMNES, is focused on the ancient Near East as well. So the aim of the bulletin is to update scholars, university students, the general public as well, about current archaeological excavations and projects in the Near East. We are live, as you can see, so at the end of each lecture there would be a section dedicated to questions, to comments. Therefore, if you desire to comment on the topic of this lecture, you can use the chat, the live chat, which is here in the YouTube page, and at the end of the lecture I'm going to read these questions or comments to our speaker. So the title of today's lecture is Climate Change and the Origins of Amorite Cultures in the Ancient Near East. And our speaker is Burke from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures of the University of California, Los Angeles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valentina, for your introduction. And I'd like to thank the co-directors of CAMNES, Stefano Valentini and Guido Garducci, for this invitation and the opportunity to talk about this topic near and dear to my heart that is a part of my research for too many years at this point, but just really reaching that point of further conversation with a broader audience as a result of my publication forthcoming in the month of February, should actually be on bookshelves. The title of my talk today is Climate Change and the Origins of Amorite Cultures in the Ancient Near East. And by any standard, this is an extremely broad topic I've cast for myself in trying to highlight a particular moment within the research that I'd like to talk about, notably around the mid-third millennium to the end of the third millennium, an inflection point of sorts within the broad arc of discussing Amorite identity. My research is a culmination of a number of years of study now of the question of Amorite identity, what you could call exploring identity, specifically that of the Amorites in the long durée, looking at the arc of history from about 2500 BC to about 1500 BC. An ambitious scope by any definition, and certainly one that merits a lot of nuancing and consideration of a broad set of concerns and questions that range from southern Mesopotamia, even the Persian Gulf, places like Bahrain, through the Fertile Crescent, all the way over to the Levant, and into parts of the Delta of Egypt. These are subjects, obviously, that extend far beyond the expertise of any one individual. So I enter this research and speak about it in a very humble fashion. One is engaging with everything from Assyriological studies in Mesopotamia and Mesopotamian archaeology, two separate subjects themselves, to broader questions of Near Eastern and Levantine archaeology, even Egyptian archaeology, and of course, behind that, textual traditions from the western part of the ancient Near East and even into Egypt. So if one is going to look at this, there's certainly a lot to look at. And I will not say that it is exhaustive, but I hope that it is, in some respects, comprehensive in its attempts to try to understand what it is we mean when we're talking about Amorites. So I would like to focus in particular on narrowing this down a bit because it is such an ambitious topic. To look at chapters 2 and 3, in particular in the late third millennium, this question of communities at the margins and tracking these agropastoral communities in what we might call beyond pastoralism. an inflection point in the late third millennium around 2200 BC that sees at least two major reasons that the movement of individuals contributes to the growth of Amorite cultures or communities in the first place, but gradually into cultural identities across a broad swath of the ancient Near East. And so I'd like to explore this and sort of take you through some of the thinking. It is a humbling thing to look at the various profound studies that have been offered across a range of disciplines and to see the points that potentially they intersect in ways that individuals who were working on them might not have gotten a chance to explore or seen how they touch upon other subjects. And I hope that if I can contribute something in my talk today, it's this idea that these things can be brought together and that they do have something to say to one another. The first sort of point of starting this discussion and exploration of Amorite identity and how it contributes to the growth of Amorite cultures begins in a zone across a wide swath of the ancient Near East and the Fertile Crescent, a zone identified by Tony Wilkinson for about 20 years ago as the zone of uncertainty. This region is sort of the marginal space underneath the Fertile Crescent. I think it maybe is the greatest conceptual identity with regard to this area since the term Fertile Crescent was coined. And in this analysis or this identification, Tony Wilkinson suggested that you have a very clear and unified region known as the zone of uncertainty, part of what he also expanded upon and called the Fragile Crescent, that receives only roughly 200 to 300 or 20 centimeters to 30 centimeters of rain annually, just at the margins of what is possible for rain-fed agriculture, because of course, most of this region did not have the riverine communities to create large agricultural surplus. And so you're dealing with having to survive with rain-fed agriculture. What's fascinating about this zone is that it experienced a particular floret of settlement from the early third millennium down through about 2200 BC, something we'll get to again later in the talk, and saw a massive expansion of population during this period of time. Now, that's a long time for that to develop, but it is a consistent trend over those many centuries, culminating in a very large number of people living in some very large settlements by the mid-third millennium, with several hundred years of flourishing settlement in agropastoral communities. We can call this agropastoral extensification. It's very clear that this is a spreading perhaps primarily from obviously the more humid zones to the north and west of this territory that you see shaded in gray on the right side of the screen. And the exploitation is both locally of agricultural potential on this land, but also dovetailing nicely with the pastoral components that would have exploited the extreme margins of this region and create a particularly unique identity. Now, in this wide zone running from the southern Levant all the way over to the Zagros and Iran and the edge of the Persian Gulf, we have large communities emerging in this period, especially by the mid-third millennium. And we could call these communities living at the margins, communities at the margins that are thriving, especially those latter 3 centuries of this phase. It is an interesting thing that despite the fact that you see this surging population, the truth of the overall arc of the third millennium is a gradual declining environmental situation with a precipitous decline and fall off around 2200 BC with regards to precipitation and the potential for rain-fed agriculture. So we can speak of communities in this zone, and if we're combining a kind of archaeological view with a textual view, we have various labels we can attach to communities that seem to be exploiting these areas. These are communities in addition to kingdoms and political entities like Ebla and Mari Nagar that can perhaps have their own separate identities and are composite communities of various groups. But in particular here, I want to emphasize a narrative of the more marginal communities, and maybe here it's a double entendre. It's referring to those living in these marginal zones, but also individuals who are a footnote, at least at the beginning, to most of the narratives that we would reconstruct about the third millennium in Mesopotamia. Among these, Amorites, Sumerians, and Guteans. And though I won't be talking today about Sumerians and Guteans, it became clear in the course of my research that one could be writing narratives, very analogous, comparable narratives, concerning the Sumerians and Guteans that one seeks to write for the Amorites. Now, and for various reasons, Amorites have a kind of higher profile in the literature. Some of this may be biblical bias from the 20th century, but certainly there is a great deal more datum points for the Amorite communities. But I do want to suggest that there is a future avenue of looking at the Sumerians and Guteans with respect to this broader question of what happens to these communities at the margins and how do they develop. I'd like to look at maybe just one case study here in the northern Levant at the intersection between the zone of uncertainty as it comes out of northern Mesopotamia and goes into part of the northern Levant that maybe shares more in common with Mesopotamia, but also provides a kind of fulcrum around which we can see analogous circumstances to the east and north in Mesopotamia and south in a smaller zone that would carry into the southern Levant. So we'll look at the area around Khatna and Ebla here briefly as we explore the growth of pastoralism and what it means to create a kind of community identity among these various communities inhabiting this marginal zone. During this period from 3000 to about 2200 BC, when we see this growth of agropastoralism on the margins, it's fair to say that what we see across this region is an exploitation of a shared common environmental niche. These communities have very much this in common. I think it's fair to argue that we're looking at settlement that is extending probably not from very far away in many cases. You might say Khatna here and its relationship to communities to its east, Ebla to those communities to its east and southeast. While they politically might fall under the purview of the kingdom of Ebla here, elsewhere under the kingdom of Mari, we can see anchor communities, as I refer to them, perhaps extending these endeavors into the margin gradually over the course of the third millennium, and by the mid-third millennium are solidly entrenched and thriving then from about 2500 to 2200 BC. This wouldn't have been a new zone to exploit. What we see here is a true extensification of settlement into areas that are being increasingly exploited. This would have been a zone through which herds passing through would have been hunted. Sheep could have been taken out there for pasture even prior to this. But by extending into this region and sort of banking on the conditions that could be exploited, we see an intensive economic exploitation of a zone that otherwise maybe was more piecemeal exploited in the early third millennium. So it's a sort of hardening of architecture. With respect to the Ebla archives, this is obviously done in good measure for a certain amount of wool that's being produced and huge herds that are being taken to this region. From places like Mara that sits within this and just a little bit north of the picture that I'm showing you now, it's clear that onager breeding, or at least onager harvesting, was taking place within this zone and probably being brought in for interbreeding, creating these kunga for Sumerian interest, and of course, harvesting the hides from these animals as part of that. So there are multiple reasons why these communities would have grown up and become settled down and established during the third millennium. What is fascinating about this phenomenon is that these communities begin to share a great deal in common with respect to general aspects of material culture and character in ways that if, let's say 100 years ago, we had been looking at all these communities we might have, begun at the beginning by suggesting a great deal of similarity between them. Instead, our focus was on larger urban areas like southern Mesopotamia, and of course, for biblical reasons, parts of the southern Levant. But there really is something that seems shared about these communities. And in particular, let's look at one of these on the eastern fringe of the zone of uncertainty in the northern Levant, and up against a feature that dates to the second half of the third millennium at least, the Très Long Mur, this very long wall, fragments of which you can see on the map here, tracing over nearly 200 some odd kilometers. It's an extensive piece of architecture that probably sort of sets a conceptual boundary of exploitation. At least that's one way of approaching it. Al-Rawda has been extensively explored in recent years. Corinne Castel has been behind these excavations, collaborating. Of course, this is more or less ceased since 2010. But in the explorations up to that point, we have here a classic sort of radial pattern town of substantial size that fits into a number of such towns for which we have mostly the topography and less of the sort of plans like you get from the geomagnetics of this site. Now, what I want to argue here, and stepping away maybe from drilling down into the archaeology specifically, is that we're looking at a series of communities founded by these anchor communities that share something in common and create a shared identity or culture, I guess you could argue. When one looks around for how to articulate this, I find in particular a really useful concept coming from Etienne Wenger called communities of practice. Now this study, anthropological, sociological really, exploration of communities of practice, what in other terms you might call a guild, explores how it is that you get rather specifically a culture emerging out of a group of people who engage in similar economic activities, specifically sort of business practices of some sort. So the study there in the 1990s was looking specifically at these characteristics of workplaces. What I would like to argue, and this has been something that our other archaeologists have pulled into their work as well, is that we can see a growing tradition here of communities, contemporaneous communities, all throughout this zone of uncertainty, certainly from the northern Levant and into Mesopotamia, that share a great deal in common with respect to sort of their foundations, their concerns with regard to security, environmental experiences, that if this zone experiences a sort of shared amount of rainfall or declines as a result of a set of common circumstances, then these communities are sharing a fate. And the way that they go about exploiting this countryside would have created a kind of sharing of practices. And that at some point, we can expect that there would have been, especially as they push out in this direction, with a limited distance between them, some degree of sharing of kin, even intermarriage, cultivating stronger ties. That as much as it might create conflict, and it certainly, I think, is arguably did, as maybe the early references to conflicts between Mari and Ebla, maybe some of this is behind all of this. But what we see is a sort of creation of a set of shared circumstances, so that despite differences that we can definitely point to, archaeologists love their differences for categorizing and classifying material culture, these communities shared in a common enterprise as agropastoral and hunting communities on these marginal zones. They were engaging in a certain amount of shared risk that might have created context for them to develop cohesive and greater exchanges in this particular environmental and socioeconomic conditions. This contributes, I would argue, and it's visible in various manifestations, only a couple of which we'll talk about, but that they developed aspects of material culture Even, one might classify the planning of these towns in an almost systematic fashion as part of that broader conceptual framework that cultivated this broader shared material culture. We'll look even at temple architecture as one of these things. And ultimately, in the creation of a kind of community of practice as an identity, they share in a historical origin, even if there is some variance in the progression of these communities. One could say that if they were telling stories about where they come from and the nature of their identities, it's going to be wedded to these foundations as agropastoral communities. So you can see where I'm going with this, hopefully, in the idea that there's a creation of an identity among a broad swath of communities that is not an insubstantial number of people. We're really talking about hundreds of thousands, if not, upwards of 500,000 people living across this arc at its peak who are sharing in these related practices. So I want to look here in particular at some of the features of Rawda, maybe mostly one beyond the town planning, and that is temple architecture. This is something that I digress pretty substantially on in my work, in large measure because it stems from this broader geographic region and carries with it, I think, to other places as we see the mobility among individuals in the late third millennium. Now, al-Rawda, in the three areas that I just highlighted in the magnetometry already, you could see clear quarters of the town with what seem to be independent temple complexes. To my mind, if we're looking at the way that social structure in the ancient Near East works, these are largely kin-based, maybe tribes or clans within the city that are having their own temple as an expression of their particular sets of beliefs or maybe devotions to an individual or sets of gods. So that's pretty significant. We might easily look past it, we might overlook it, but if we stop ourselves and say, in places like southern Mesopotamia, even later on in the Middle Bronze Age, we would expect a more concentrated approach to cultic traditions that might see more state control in the center of the site. Now, that's not to say that there weren't temples in that center part of the city, but I want to argue that what we're seeing here is some reflection of the devotion of smaller social groups within these larger towns, these towns ranging from 5 to 60 hectares in size in many cases. So very large communities indeed in these marginal zones. So at the core of these temple complexes, aside from these sort of large open enclosures, temenos that are formed, they centered seemingly on a direct access structure that in a more convoluted way, maybe I refer to as the direct access temple in Antis with this longer expression, because at one point you may or may not get the ante, these projections from the front sides of the temple, but you still get this fixation on this direct access structure and a prolific and productive architectural plan that gets picked up and widely employed, irrespective of the question of which deity is being worshipped in these temple complexes. Alongside this, a sort of separate issue is the use of often aniconic standing stones in proximity of these temples, suggesting that, again, it's not just the temple architecture that's being borrowed here and becomes more prolific in the years and centuries to follow, but rather even a set of general cultic practices, ways of approaching the worship and veneration of deities. And so standing stones from the third millennium for more than a millennium become a part of these temple complexes. If we were to bring together some of the evidence in this from really the mid-third millennium to around 2200 from various sites in the Levant, but also maybe many more will know those from Upper Mesopotamia, we have a broad range of these direct access temples in Antis. And you can see here the scale. Obviously, the ones in Mesopotamia are a little bit bigger, although maybe on the left side here, the Levant ones are on a slightly different scale for the illustration. But you can see the general plan of these temples, the focus of the deity being in the back, although rarely does one find anything to give away the presence of the deity at the moment of its destruction. Now, I won't get into exploring it here more in great depth, but I wanted to recognize again, looking at this zone in the northern Levant as our case study, that a site like Ebla demonstrates the long enduring nature and the relationship of these mid-third millennium traditions to traditions that carry all the way down to the mid-second millennium. And here in particular is a temple in area HH at Ebla to the southeast of the Acropolis, known as the Temple of the Rock. It is founded directly on the bedrock in the mid-third millennium. And in the upper left, you see the progression of historical developments of that temple, mostly diminishing in size over time, at least this particular temple. And an illustration that in this geographic region, we are seeing the adaptation, the borrowing of this temple architecture. And while we'll see it in many other places, Ebla provides us a unique opportunity to see how it evolves at one place through time, and that we can link temples that are often referred to, especially in the southern Levantine sphere, by different names, fundamentally seeing them link back to this early tradition connected with agropastoral communities at the margins and their anchor communities, places like Ebla. And putting in scale some examples of these from hundreds of years later, something that I spend an inordinate amount of time, perhaps in my book, exploring, we see the adoption of this temple style. It's very clear in the southern Levant, where we don't get much larger temple complexes around them, places running from the northern Levant at Ebla down to Hatzor, Shechem in the highlands north of Jerusalem, Tel Haror in the Negev towards Egypt, that this temple type becomes iconic and central to cultic practices in the age of truly, a period where few will question politically Amorites were dominating. And in southern Mesopotamia, places like Ur and other places where we look at these complexes and we think, well, this is profoundly different. And I want to note here that both of these slides are to scale, illustrating the size of these temples and the tradition in the Levant, in the absence of a much more complicated series of complexes that would suggest many cultic personnel. In southern Mesopotamia and throughout Mesopotamia, you get these much more complexes, but at the core of these complexes is again this adherence, adoption, and integration of a direct access temple plan that was so prolific in northern Mesopotamia and the northern Levant, and made its way by the mid-third millennium into areas like the zone of uncertainty. So it is interesting to see the long arc and trajectory of this particular tradition and its integration into different cultural traditions to the west and the east. But this is just one example that one could take much further through time to illustrate where my argument is going, at least in broad arc. Now let's return to these communities at the margins geographically, from the northern Levant, especially through upper Mesopotamia and into western Iran. Whether we're speaking of Amorites, Subarians, or Guteans, we're talking about a substantial groups of populations that for most of our Mesopotamian narrative, historical narratives, are at the margins of the story. The story centers on places like southern Mesopotamia. But by the time we get to the Akkadian period, we start to see substantive historical interventions, ones that we can reconstruct from historical sources, that destabilize in ways that we had only limited clues prior to this. Now, obviously, going back to earlier parts of prior to the Akkadian period, we have Lugal-Zagessi and others who may have made forays into the northern Levant, but nothing like the sustained manner in which the Akkadian Empire intervened militarily and even set up shop buildings like at Tel Brak that betray intervention in a very serious and concerted way. And I would argue that we have here around 2200 BC an inflection point caused by two primary things. On the one hand, the Akkadian Empire, and as we'll see in a minute, climate change that brings about aridification, decline in conditions across this region. So you have a 1-2 punch, if you will, that destabilizes the region. Just briefly, without getting into the various aspects of Akkadian intervention in the region, I want to highlight this moment in the reign of Naram-Sin that perhaps we can situate historically around 2213 BC, when he takes on a variety, I guess you could really call it a coalition of different communities that decide to rebel against the Akkadian Empire. It was more than likely, as suggested by a careful reading of this text, that this is a concerted action by various enemies of the Akkadian state. And he goes about subduing this insurgency, carrying out campaigns across vast regions, and even references going up the Euphrates to the place known as Mount Bashar, Jebel Bishri, the Amorite mountain, where he takes control of a number of individuals, 9 chiefs, and even tells us how many thousands he deported from the area, and says that he captured the king of Apishal, or by the name of Apishal. So this is an interesting, intersection directly with a group that we would qualify as Amorites, now putting more labels on this region. And I should step back for a moment and say, we do have references both in the Ebla archives and in southern Mesopotamian sources about the locations of the Amuru in the regions that I put them on the maps earlier. So I'm sort of assuming that most are aware of that general understanding. But here, by about 2200, we're starting to see that intersection of the southern Mesopotamian narrative with that more common to northern Mesopotamia and the Levant. Now, that in itself would be pretty substantial for the sort of intervention and the potential ramifications for creating secondary state formation and other processes in shaping the identity of groups in those northern regions. You could see coalescence and the creation of alliances. But I would argue that very much in this moment, and this moment may be 50 years, it may be 100, but it's probably fairly discrete, that the intersection of climatological change along with the Akkadian military intervention brings about substantive change to these communities, that you are either going to survive or you're going through adaptation and flight to more survivable regions, or you're simply going to fade away. And I think that the inflection point here suggests that we can track the changes. Now, the reason I suggest that is because of the changes of settlement patterns that one can correlate to this moment of around 2200 BC and the ensuing decades. Much of my work here borrows and builds upon the growing body of information, data, and analysis that individuals like Harvey Weiss, certainly as the leader behind these observations, have brought to bear over about 30 years now. And for a long time, I, like many others, might have been resistant to the ideas that there should be such sharp and nuanced change. I'm not particularly concerned with whether or not the Akkadian Empire per se was brought down by these climatological changes. I would argue that I don't really see that being the case. It may have threatened the very areas that it thought it would bring under its control, and in some sense, that's going to undermine its ambitions. But what's more important is that the region that the Akkadians were after and interested in was also a region that would experience environmental decline. And various proxy data, as you see on the right side of the slide here, have really come together to illustrate that there is a substantive change. Correlating with that, as we'll see in a minute, is of course changes to the settlement patterns. And the question is, are the two caused by, is the decline in the settlement pattern caused by this environmental situation, or is it more complicated? And I'm suggesting that it correlates with both the Akkadian intervention and a decline in circumstances. Now, and that it really probably took both to bring about this decline. Now, if you're not convinced that this is an important subject and that it might have had this effect, especially on marginal zones, I invite you to consider that in recent years, the International Climatological Commission has recognized that this is indeed its own distinct period. It brings about a period that has been referred to as the Meghalayan, named after a cave in India where some of this proxy data comes from. And so while the impact of the changes in our particular region here that we're exploring, the zone of uncertainty, contribute to aridification, this was perhaps not the case everywhere, and we shouldn't expect the same picture. And so that this is not an utter collapse of the Fertile Crescent, but rather a contraction event that was caused by aridification. If we can accept to some extent or another that aridification is happening around 2200, and that the Akkadian Empire's interventions in the region were also significant events in the shaping of identity, and perhaps also the depopulation and population stress on the region that caused people and communities to consider moving from the region, then we can start to explore exactly where the narrative goes from here. Where do the substantive communities that inhabited this zone of uncertainty move to? How do they adapt? What do they do to exploit, to pursue resilience through such difficult circumstances? And by all intents and for all intents and purposes, in the grand scheme of ancient Near Eastern history, the events that unfolded here probably did so over a handful of decades rather than centuries. So that while our resolution on the before and after is very often on a century level, when one looks at something like the climatological data, this doesn't look like this tipping point was a gradual one, but rather the aridification that was to some extent happening up to this point took a tipping point very quickly and ended up where we are left at 2200. So we see settlement decline across the zone of uncertainty from 2200 BC through various analyses, both done by Harvey Weiss and replicated by myself, and trying to account for the various nuances. Indeed, in the true sense of science, testing the hypothesis and the considerations, it's fair to say we can arrive at numbers that are in excess of several 100,000 people, and that is specifically from Upper Mesopotamia, at sites that are 5 to 60 hectares in size that for the most part are abandoned. Some at the more humid edges of the zone of uncertainty experience contraction, but between contraction and total abandonment of a number of sites, we are looking at in excess of 300,000 people from just Upper Mesopotamia alone. If we were conservative and considered that there are smaller villages and other communities, and we expand this region, we're getting close to something like 500,000 people potentially that are put on the move within a fairly short amount of time. Again, at most, maybe a few decades, even though our resolution might be longer. And so it is interesting that in this context, we see settlement expansion as an inverse correlation to this in certain areas, what Harvey Weiss has referred to as refugia, whether it's the northern Levant or parts of southern Mesopotamia and the Mesopotamian river system, especially the middle Euphrates. Now, this puts us in a point of, if we can accept that these two events are coming together, Akkadian intervention and climatological change, then we are looking at how we follow this narrative. And in the next few slides, which I'll try to keep brief, this is where we have to go beyond pastoralism, that the identity that Amorite communities, Sumerians even, and to some extent Gudean communities may have had with pastoralism becomes a kind of footnote to a more complex identity that emerges as a result of the need to adapt to their circumstances. And here I'd like to sort of discuss some of that. In the northern Levant, we can see the growth of settlement among and around certain communities like Katna to its west, that by the late third millennium is seeing a flourishing of communities around that settlement. And it should be little surprise that after 2000, we start to see the growth of a kingdom in its own independence. Now, these are protracted dominoes, a series of dominoes that unfold, but definitely related to this movements of populations from the marginal zones like al-Rawda inland. And so these become frontier towns that are, literally like many American Western towns, still standing in these very desert-like environments with no subsequent settlement, by and large, until more modern times. And so that's a very profound abandonment of, whatever you might have called it, a frontier of exploitation that was taking place. Now, a big part of my analysis has been, if indeed the circumstances here point to a kind of migration out that would be called in most circumstances refugee flight, then what exactly can we bring to bear from these kinds of studies? And in other studies that I've conducted over the last decade, looking at the question of refugees, and even some of the literature that is non-archaeological, there are correlates that we can imagine and begin to pursue. Landlessness, homelessness, and levels of insecurity to communities. Joblessness, what usually contributes to subsistence in antiquity, even if that's an anachronistic term. But questions of food insecurity. Marginalization, what happens to individuals who are marginalized as a result of needing to now move? Increased morbidity and mortality. Will we see places where these practices of burial would reflect these changes? Lost common property. These temples and communities, if they indeed belong to kinship groups, are now lost common property. And we're going to see communities go in different directions, especially as they more likely pursue next of kin or familial relations, even within these communities of practice, ways of tracking out of this region. So rather than maybe seeing habitat tracking as Harvey Weiss has suggested, I'm suggesting a more human component of tracking after your family and next of kin in ways that might provide you a resilience strategy. I'm not going to get too much into the details of this because it can get quite, there's quite a bit of detail one can get into in exploring it. But I find very interesting that in southern Mesopotamia, for example, a figure like Gudea of Lagash in the years after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire emerges to co-opt a number of symbols of power and tradition that will later on become not only prevalent in the Ur-3 period, but especially adopted by Amorite kings and rulers after 2000. It is interesting to imagine to some extent here that what Gudea is providing is a kind of filter between the hardened perspective of the Akkadian Empire with respect to marginal and peripheral groups, and Gudea, very likely himself, a part of a minority community or some other community within this Gutean period, would be a way of sort of filtering foreign elements that in bringing people together into southern Mesopotamia, as many may have migrated down there, including Amorites, maybe to some extent Sumerians and even Guteans, we have this moment where he can serve as a kind of filter to their experiences, and that this unevenness between these city-states and the rise of an individual like Gudea can be a negotiator between these various communities. Now, we don't get a lot of direct references to this, but I explore this a bit more in my book. Now, if we track out and we follow some of these specific lines, it is a fascinating thing to see that some correlates, especially settlement changes, might reflect these phenomena. Radical urbanization in southern Mesopotamia, something that goes back to the work of Robert McCormick Adams. Seeing settlement growth in riparian zones, as Harvey Weiss has emphasized, along the Euphrates and the vicinity of Mari, not outside of the zone of uncertainty, but in a riparian zone that guarantees that these communities can sustain agropastoralism despite changing conditions. And it's interesting that if we track a little bit later into the early second millennium, we actually see a reflection of this. This is the first point at which we can really point to some of these names, at least that I'm aware of, that connect to Amorite tribal elements, like Sipar, a long established community, has Sipar Amnanum and Sipar Yakrurum. And of course, there's a whole series of settlement names in the early second millennium that suggest connections to Amorite linguistic groups, individuals who may have tracked down to southern Mesopotamia in these last couple centuries of the third millennium. Related to the question of pivoting from the subsistence that agropastoralism afforded these communities as they moved to the northern Levant and parts of Mesopotamia, in Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, it is interesting to see perhaps and to interpret some of these staples of our analyses through the lens of the possibility of how you may have viewed them for accommodating foreign populations. So a decline in pastoral nomadism meant some need for subsistence strategies for these communities. And here I, in an earlier analysis that was completely unrelated to this, imagine that some of these public works projects, just the scale of them, but also the endeavoring to undertake some of these, might very well relate to these sorts of foreign populations, be they Amorites, Guteans, Subarians, who are present among these southern Mesopotamian communities. Likewise, in a sort of analogous fashion, is the issue of the rising presence of mercenarism, a subject that is maybe too often just a footnote to our historical studies. But in the Ur-3 period, we see the rise even of a capacity of the chief of the Amorites and the presence of individuals who are specifically identified as Amorites within sort of royal bodyguard or Praetorian guard of the Ur-3 kings. So this is a significant possibility that the individuals are finding other ways of carrying on. And in the zone that was a part of the military interventions of Mesopotamia, it is perhaps not surprising that some of these individuals would have been experienced in warfare. And this is something we see analogous circumstances in other historical periods. In other ways, there are ways that we should anticipate identifying factionalism. Now, we know if we go to the Old Babylonian period, even by extensive consideration of texts, Amorites are a minority. I mean, by no doubt. I mean, you have to go up to Mari before among Amorite or among names, you would reach anything like 40% of the community potentially as identified by names and markings as Amorite. In southern Mesopotamia, it seems that we might reach a peak among some communities as at 10%. So we're still talking about a minority of individuals. And in that context, we should expect a certain amount of factionalism and marginalization that would have been present in these communities. And we should anticipate in our historical and textual analyses, how is it that we might be seeing some reflections of that? We, I think, are seeing, increasingly, obviously, in former studies, the presence of Amorite names, maybe even the intrusion of Amorite vocabulary into Akkadian in the late third millennium, but especially in the early second millennium. In this context, we have questions of what gets classified as an Amorite language, and this issue runs also into the Levant, where we might say that even Ugaritic later on is stemming from Amorite language traditions. Even Dennis Pardee would suggest so. But perhaps Sutian and other traditions should be seen as part of the broader sets of linguistic traditions that would connect back to Amorite. But more important here is this corpus of names that just burgeons in the late third millennium and into the early second millennium connected to these groups. And among these are affiliations to Amorite tribal identities. As we saw at Sipar, these names of these neighborhoods are directly connected to these tribal identities. And indeed, here is a whole issue which I find absolutely fascinating and definitely needs more exploration in the realm of philological analysis, is that we really might be better off in many cases considering these tribal identities and exploring them individually to really understand the broader Amorite phenomenon. And the degree to which we have the emergence of these political factions that contribute to the growth of Old Babylonian states under Amorite control in the early second millennium. Here too, I have an interesting interest in law and its emergence in the late third millennium, at least as reflected through things like the laws of Ur-Nammu. What makes it so important to put down into writing these legal concerns seen from the state? Are the laws of Ur-Nammu and subsequent emphasis on legal traditions, especially by the time, we all know Hammurabi's laws, but also laws of Eshnuna, Lipit Ishtar. Is there something about the nature of the mixing of these communities that has brought this to the fore? Emphasize the need to codify this and to propagate it in writing so that individuals are aware of this. Now, it's obvious that there are local traditions that may be largely tribal, as Laura Culbertson has analyzed, and I think that's a very profound and very important observation, that by and large, these rulers would hope that these problems that communities had could be legally solved or addressed through clans and kinship structures, and that, I would argue that these laws perhaps function in a kind of firewall way, a way of guaranteeing that if you can't resolve between these communities your own problems, then if it comes to me as king, this is the law of the land. So I would argue that we have to rethink even some of these things as basic as our understandings of legal traditions in the late third millennium and early second millennium within the context of these massive movements. Now, the Ur-3 state is also really fascinating in and of itself for its focus, and this map taken from the Rofe Atlas, I think, says it all, as do other maps that basically show the same thing. There seems to be almost no concern with areas up to the north. Obviously, there's a certain amount of connection to places like Mari, and there are place names throughout that region referenced in text, but it is awesome, I think is the only word that one can bring up, to see the fall off in references and connections to places to the west. And I think we have to consider that this period of decline is largely the reason that this looks the way it does when it concerns connections to the west. Now, by the Ur-3 period then, to use Giorgio Bucciolati's title for his very monumental work, and I hope he's in the audience today, the Amorites of the Ur-3 period give us that moment where we're trying to make a fulcrum between our understandings of the identities of Amorites in the third millennium and what comes afterwards. And I really do provide that moment where we can make connections between these long-lived, across this long-lived identity. The personal names are prolific in southern Mesopotamia, even if they still are a minority. We see that individuals are now integrated pretty extensively in a range of occupations that include everything from the mercenaries and capacities that are referenced earlier to many other capacities. We see these Old Babylonian settlements with these tribal names. And so there is a sort of before and after that we have to work through and trying to understand arriving at this set of circumstances by the early second millennium. And an entirely separate narrative, if we were to track this question to the west, something that today I really can't address. But it is fascinating that despite the changes that must have happened during the Akkadian period, that this persists through the Ur-3 period, that we continue to see incursions as well as problems with local Amorite communities during the reigns of Shulgi and Shusin, and the construction of walls, which no one really believes any longer were holding anybody back, but they were definitely part of an effort to pivot under these circumstances. And it seems that there was persistent out-migration from that region and its margins through much of the late third millennium. As those conditions did not abate, we can expect that there would have been still some movement. By the end of the Ur-3 period and the reign of Ibbi-Sin, we have, of course, this famous letter, which by looking at Michalowski's work, at least this one, we can maybe put some confidence in as a general reflection of the circumstances, that the pressures from Amorites in particular but perhaps also from Guteans and Suberians, contribute to stresses on southern Mesopotamian communities and political power in particular that erode the efforts of this fairly short-lived Ur-3 state. Now, I'd like to end on something that many of you might have thought I would begin with, which is the characterization of Amorites in the famous Sumerian literary piece known as the Marriage of Martu. This is the place that many would begin, because here in this particular piece of literature, we had a characterization of the Amorite as the one who dwells on the mountain, carries on in sort of fighting and strife in the Kur and knows no submission. He eats uncooked meat. What an animal, I guess. He has no house while he lives. He is not interred when he dies. My friend, how is it that you would marry Martu? I mean, if you know the story, this is because this daughter is interested in marrying this individual known as Martu, which is, of course, a reference to the Amuru, and in this case, these individuals being divinized. What I want to say here to close with is that this is preserved in the Old Babylonian period, and we don't have any copies or any sense that this particular piece of literature, even if there are hints and clues that such characterizations may have existed, that this is a good, accurate reflection of how we should think about Amorites. What I would argue, and I'll leave you with this before we have questions, is that this is triumphalist literature. In the Old Babylonian period, a period when Amorites are obviously ruling towns around southern Mesopotamia, for all extents and purposes, ruling in places throughout the Levant, to write a piece like this with throwbacks to older, perhaps pejorative characterizations, and to emphasize just this portion of the story is to give somewhat of a mischaracterization. In the end, the lady marries the Martu, and you have to wrap your head around the fact that this individual who is part of a marginalized community is married to this goddess who otherwise is being told by her family, don't marry this individual. So that, I think, sets up a very different characterization in many regards to older information. And I hope, that if some of the things I've said here aren't that clear, that you'll dive a little deeper with me in exploring the book. And, I look forward to time ahead to clarify some of my thoughts on this subject. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and of course, congratulations for your massive work about this subject. So, as I mentioned, this final part is dedicated to your questions. If you have doubts, if you want to learn more about this topic, unfortunately, for the moment, we don't have questions, but I would like to remind you that if you do have questions, you can write your comments in the live chat, and I will read these questions to our speaker. So in the meantime, I would like to ask you something.
Yes.
I'm particularly interested in al-Rawda, and I was wondering what kind of funerary rituals were worshipped there?
To my knowledge, and it may simply be that I haven't seen the latest that Corinne Castell has been able to publish, I'm not aware at that site that anyone has been digging any burials. I could simply be wrong. I would defer to analogous settlements, places like Mara, although there we have some very profound ritual burials within the central Acropolis. But I would look at other sites for that particular aspect of the question. I wouldn't expect that these are going to be radically different than things that you might find in the vicinity of Katna and other archaeological sites in the area.
Great, thank you. I will check on those. Thank you. And I've got actually another question in the meantime while we are waiting for the questions by the public. In your book, in the preface of your book, and I quote, you write, I've often asked myself why I have endeavored to attempt to write this book. The answer, I believe, is to be found in my training in the Near Eastern studies that, while firmly rooted in Near Eastern archaeology, required intensive exposure to languages and historical traditions of the ancient Near East from Egypt to Mesopotamia. And in fact, your lecture was based on that as well. And therefore, my question is, in your opinion, of course, how important is multidisciplinarity in archaeology?
Yeah, it's a blessing and a curse. Because, you know, we're in an age where to do a lot of the studies we want to do, we feel a need to specialize. And obviously the dissertation, the PhD from the very beginning, is steering you in the direction of being specialized. And yet, if you want to answer bigger questions, it's difficult often to do them from a narrow speciality. Looking at, you know, residue analysis alone won't answer your questions about subsistence strategies and consumption. You're going to have to look at the entire ceramic assemblage. You're going to have to look at botanical remains. And so, you know, just in that example, I'm illustrating areas where, you know, any number of specialists are the specialist of a given subject, and you have to bring all of this material into dialogue. So I think, you know, it's always a double-edged sword. We're dealing with massive amounts of information more than ever. I don't know about you, but I feel overwhelmed regularly trying to keep up with bibliography. And it's very tempting to get highly specialized, and it is certainly useful and necessary because that provides us with a corpus of data that we need that then becomes part of a bigger picture. But there is something highly valuable in stepping back and sort of bringing these pieces together into some discussion, into conversation, whether they're the environmental component or the assyriological component or the archaeological component. And I, you know, for better or worse, I would encourage everyone to step out of our comfort zones and to endeavor to do those collaborations, because I think the possibility for the directions of our field are impressive. You know, what we can do, whether or not my analysis is correct, there is much to be done in looking at these sort of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches. Hopefully I haven't scared everyone off at this hour.
There's a comment. So maybe not a question. I don't know. I'm gonna read it. But
Okay.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. Therefore, you were not. He was not scared. I'm sorry. I read with interest the book, especially the part regarding the temple in Antis tradition. As for the temples, so there's a question. Did you find a particular type of burial structure or funerary practice linked to the migrations of the Amorites intramuros tombs?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because it's also a big part of my research. I mean, obviously something that becomes in a talk unto itself. I do think, and here I follow a bit Nicola Laneri's research and others who have looked at this question over the axis of the late third millennium and early second millennium, that there is a concern with maintenance of identity through intramural burials, and very often within intra-house burials, literally residential burials, as they've been called. And there is certainly, you know, there are regional traditions, and maybe that's why I would use the expression Amorite cultures, to recognize that while there can be a relationship to a broader series of traditions, you will get local manifestations of those that adapt to the negotiations of identity between various communities locally, and adapt to environmental circumstances. So, we talk about Amorite burials in the early second millennium in the Delta of Egypt, high water table, can't bury under the ground in the same way. You have to adapt those practices to those environmental conditions. I do think that in different regions, we can point to some of these traditions, especially when we see a stark change. Now, I didn't talk about it, but the southern Levant experiences a massive population decline at around 2500 BC, to the point that there may be as few as 60,000 people living there, something the size of the city of Umma, contemporaneous city of Umma in Mesopotamia. That's astonishing. That's almost a blank slate into which any kind of changes, wherever they come from, be they from trade, intervention, colonialism, would immediately contribute to changes as those local populations interact with these outsiders, as I would argue. So you have different adaptations to the circumstances, and consequently, these engagements with these newer traditions that might come into a region reflect slightly differently in each place. But there are some unifying narratives, and this idea of residential burials and a refocusing on family identity that would especially make sense in light of such dramatic changes in the preceding at least 2 centuries, that would suggest there is a concerted concern to maintain identity in the familial unit and the kinship structure, maybe up to the clan. So I do see in certain areas, but they're slightly different, whether we're talking about the Euphrates south of Carchemish, or the northern Levant or the southern Levant. But I do think that there are regional traditions that reflect this, and I try to articulate that a bit in the book.
Thank you very much. It seems we don't have any more questions. No, we don't have any more questions. So I really would like to thank you once more for your really interesting lecture, really interesting. And I would like, of course, to thank our public. Thank you for being with us. Our next lecture would be next week, next Wednesday, so January the 20th at 5 p.m. Italy time. Mehmet Ishkle will discuss Anis Rosainili Durakai, the last great castle of the Urartu kingdom, a general review of the works in the last 30 years. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.